Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Galalde, an environment reporter at ProPublica, and I'm your host for today's presentation. We're thrilled you could join us for this conversation about how the failure to properly regulate the disposal of oil field wastewater threatens public health and the environment across the country. We'll wait a minute or two for a few more people to join, and then we'll get started. While we wait, some housekeeping. Closed captioning is available for today's session. To access that, hover your mouse over the presenter window, and you'll see a gray menu bar along the bottom of that window. Click on English CC to turn captions on. If you have any trouble accessing that, just let us know in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to help. I'll also note that we've turned off the chat display for today's event. With so many folks registered, we didn't want the chat to become distracting. However, you're more than welcome to use the Q&A option on your screen to let us know if you're experiencing any technical issues during the program. Finally, you can access a few key resources by clicking on the resources icon on the bar to the right of your screen. Included in our list of resources are links to the reporting we'll be discussing and ProPublica's tips page. All right, it looks like we've gathered enough people so we can get started. We're excited to be hosting today's event in partnership with several powerhouse news organizations, including The Frontier, DeSmog, and Inside Climate News. We couldn't do this without their vital reporting on the subject. So we're here to talk about the American oil industry's trillion-gallon time bomb. Produced water, which is the briny, toxic, radioactive wastewater that comes to the surface alongside oil and gas production. As oil fields age, the ratio of produced water to oil and gas increases, and we're still in search of an answer about what to do with all that waste. Thankfully, we've got some of our best on the case. I'd now like to welcome our panelists, Nick Bolin, Martha Piskowski, and Justin Noble, to join us on screen, a superstar group of reporters. Nick Bolin covers oil and gas in Oklahoma for The Frontier and ProPublica, and previously investigated everything Western natural resources for the magazine High Country News. Nick and I previously partnered for more than a year to uncover the true price tag of cleaning up the oil industry's mess. I will forever be grateful to him for getting me back into country music by teaching me that you can skip Nashville country, listen to Oklahoma country instead. Martha Piskowski covers oil and gas and the environment in Texas for Inside Climate News. She previously worked at the El Paso Times and began her career as a freelance journalist in Mexico. I've also had the good fortune of working alongside Martha, as together we investigated the massive volumes of methane and hydrogen sulfide gases released by her state's oil industry. And finally, Justin Noble is a reporter I've admired from afar for years. His investigations into the produced water crisis have proved prescient in his 2024 book, Petroleum 238, Big Oil's Dangerous Secret and the Grassroots Fight to Stop It, was inspired by a story he penned for Rolling Stone magazine about oil and gas radioactivity. His work has been published in Best American Science and Nature Writing and Best American Travel Writing, as well as law and scientific journals. With that, let's begin. Justin, I'm going to start with you on this one. To kick us off, can you just set the stage by defining the problem we're discussing? And beyond that, as we talk oil and gas wastewater, what's the true scale of this issue?
Yes. First, I just want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank our host organizations. It's stunning to me that this issue is not covered more in larger news organizations. They frankly really have no idea how the oil and gas industry actually works. But The Frontier, DeSmog, Inside Climate News, ProPublica have been awesome on it. And the journalists you see before you, Nick, Mark, Martha, they are really clean and crisp looking right now. But to me, they are draped in intestines because the reporting has disemboweled this industry. It's really quite impressive. So I want you to just reimagine how you think of the oil field. You know, the oil, the gas that comes up, fuels we still all use, but there's also this wastewater. And really, there's often more of the wastewater than there is the oil or gas. The industry has spent a lot of time and money and developed really sophisticated ways of dealing with the fuel, of cleaning it, of running it, transporting it. The wastewater, they have not. It's like sophisticated Stone Age. They have time and again taken the cheapest and easiest means of disposal. So initially that was just discharge to an unlined pit right beside the well. And by initially, I mean like 1800s. discharge into a quarry, discharge into a marsh, discharge into creeks, bayous. In 1920s Mississippi, discharge into a wood-sided swimming pool for children. That was a bad idea. Oil and gas wastewater, brine produced water, has toxic levels of salt, benzene, a known human carcinogen, and other volatile organics, heavy metals like lead and arsenic, and also radioactive heavy metals like radium. And now we have a different method, and this is the subject of today. So injection wells, just a little bit on amounts. 3 billion gallons a day, produced water, brine, wastewater, whatever you want to call it. That's just over 1 trillion gallons a year. If you put that into your standard size oil barrel, like waist high, you stack them atop one another, you would reach the moon and back 28 times. 96% of that, according to the latest statistics we have, is going to injection wells. So this is the way the industry has really decided to deal with this wastewater. What is an injection well? You are drilling down into a layer that has pore space, and you're injecting this wastewater at pressure. I like to use the analogy of, you have, imagine like a really nice juice, like a kind of fancy juice you get at a health food store. It's really orange and it has beta carotene and mega antioxidants, all this good stuff. And then imagine like a paper bag you would use to hold a 40 if you're drinking on the street. And you take the juice, electric orange juice, and you pour it into the paper bag. Like maybe the bag's going to hold it for like a second or two. And then it's just going to leak out and make a mess. That is what's happening underground right now across America. One more thing to think about as we go through this: flowback. So it's not just produced water. There is this other really interesting waste stream called flowback that consists of some of the chemicals shot down the well in the frac. And these chemicals are meant to enable and create and enhance cracks in rocks, right? They're things like surfactants. So that material comes up, that will also go to injection wells. Again, materials, fluids meant to crack open rocks will then be re-injected. Something to think about. Nick.
Thanks, Justin. So that's a horrifying scale, but I want to shift to kind of the current moment and potential, if there is, impact on actual people and ecosystems. So, Nick, I want to shift to you. I mean, how imminent of a threat is this? Are you saying it's in drinking water? Talk a little bit about your reporting in Oklahoma and what you've kind of seen on the ground.
Yeah. So the short answer is this is definitely in drinking water. We probably don't know we certainly don't know just how many water sources have been polluted by this stuff. But, I think everyone here on this panel has reported on instances of oil field wastewater getting into drinking water sources. So I have been reporting on Oklahoma for the past, year plus. And, I know from state public records that the state has been tracking, numerous, a dozen or more at a time, potential instances of, often rural residents of the state on private wells, who live near oil fields, live near disposal sites, and have pollution, have poison in their drinking water. In addition to that, actually on that point, this slide you're seeing here is this top image. I'm going to take a second to explain that. So this is a 3D electromagnetic scan of underground, essentially a couple 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet below the surface of a private water well. That blue thing is someone's drinking water. This is a story I wrote about for the Frontier and ProPublica earlier this year. And that red plume is exceptionally concentrated contamination, right? So the darker the color, the darker the red, the more concentrated it is. And subsequent water tests, showed that this water had extremely high levels of salt, had kind of the classic oil field, heavy metals. And as you can see, this water well is sunk right into the middle of a contamination plume. At the bottom here, you've got a little snippet of a water test, again, that I got in the course of my reporting on Oklahoma. You can see benzene. This is something Justin talked about, which is sort of the classic oil field cancer. It tends to cause blood cell cancers. And this little snippet shows it, and this is from someone's private water well. A couple who I wrote about in the first story I did for the Frontier and ProPublica, benzene at 6 times the EPA's drinking water limit in a very serious and well-documented carcinogen. So, I've seen in Oklahoma, many cases where, people on private wells have a lot, cannot have a lot of, filtration, are at a special threat from this. But in addition to that, I've seen in Oklahoma, Martha will talk about this later, but she's reported on this in Texas, that sources of municipal water supply have, that oil field wastewater has been documented, getting into supplies that cities and towns use. So, I think that we don't know the full scale of just how much drinking water is been polluted by this, and not just recently, but going back decades, because once this stuff is mixed with a water source, it's sorry about that. I seem to have been kicked off briefly. But yeah, once it's mixed with a water source, it tends to be very hard to unmix. So yeah, Mark, back to you.
Yeah. So I want to drill down, pun maybe intended, about some what you were talking about there for a second. I mean, I think this is an important visualization you've got on the screen about kind of showing the interplay between some of these wells and underground water. You and I have together written extensively about the nation's growing orphan well epidemic. So can you talk for a second about what role does that play into the produced water crisis that we're discussing now?
Sure. So, my reporting in Oklahoma is focused a lot on this, pressurized injected wastewater. It can be injected with thousands of pounds of pressure behind it, not staying where it's supposed to, essentially, right? So you put it underground, and this diagram here demonstrates, in Oklahoma, we call them purges. In Texas, they've been calling them blowouts or zombie wells. But there have been these quite dramatic instances and increasing numbers in recent years of this injected wastewater essentially getting back to the surface somehow. And it has often been happened where it has traveled underground, encountered an old well that is poorly plugged, and then, it's just kind of classic path of least resistance, right? It encounters an old well, and it runs up that well. That this well is the new pressure release valve, and it can geyser up to the surface. And so that's what this diagram is showing here. The produced water is going down this well. There's a well in the middle, kind of showing a properly plugged well that's blocking it from running up to the surface, and then this unplugged well it's running up. And then it also shows some other ways it can spread, right? If it's injected at pressures that are too high, it can crack the rock and spread underground. If the well has a hole in the casing or some kind of other mechanical failure, it can escape at shallower depths than it's supposed to and spread that way. But yeah, I mean, I think primarily in it can fracture the rock and get its way to the surface through natural faults and so on. And we'll talk about this more later, but a lot of the wastewater blowouts that all of us have reported on have been caused by a mixture of poorly plugged wells near high pressurized injection.
Well, so I think that's the perfect segue. We can't talk about any of these issues without talking about Texas, and thankfully we have an expert on Texas here. So I'm going to kick it over to Martha. You published an eye-catching story, I think it was just last week, about what happens or what appears to be produced water kind of gurgling from underground in the parking lot of the First Baptist Church in Grand Falls, Texas. So with this liquid increasingly coming into contact with more populated areas, can you talk a little bit about what are the health and safety concerns surrounding this waste?
Thanks, Mark. I'm really glad to be here with everybody. So last week, I reported on this latest leak in the Permian Basin in Texas. The Railroad Commission is the state agency that regulates oil and gas in Texas. They responded very quickly and are investigating. So we don't have a lot of details yet on the specific source, but judging from previous incidents in the Permian, we have this pattern of too much pressure underground from the injection wells. And then to release that pressure, the water finds its way up through these old well bores. So the photo on the aerial photo is of this church. It's in a small town in the Permian. Since that photo was taken, the crews have dug out this bigger hole to identify where the water is coming from. But having this happen in the middle of a town is quite concerning. As Nick and Justin explained, there's a lot of metals and different constituents in this water that you don't want to come into contact with. And, property damage is a really big concern for residents and landowners in the Permian. Talking with people there, there's sort of this fear of where is the next blowout going to happen. And this incident here in Grand Falls, again, there's not a definitive explanation yet from the regulators, but there is a plugged well right where that church is, and there's numerous plugged wells throughout the town. So we're just facing this situation where this old infrastructure built up over a century of oil drilling in the Permian is interacting with this pressure problem underground. And, one of the biggest concerns, as Nick mentioned, is groundwater contamination. If this water is coming up from the formation where it's supposed to be stored permanently, that means it's also passing through the aquifers. And, West Texas is a very dry area. These places get maybe 10, 12 inches of rain a year. So preserving that groundwater is really essential for just the ongoing sustainability of these communities. And you'll see in that map, it's a little out of date. We could add some more recent blowouts and leaks to it. But it's really this area in Crane, Pecos, Ward counties where a lot of these incidents have happened. And this latest one in Grand Falls is right in this same zone. And then that final picture is another blowout that occurred, and just this hole that was created in the surface as the crews responded.
So an issue like this, we're just learning about it, right? I've just been seeing the discourse start to spread over the past couple of years. Is it true that no one's known until recently? I want to direct this to Justin because, I think you've got a fascinating historical context. You found some interesting records documenting the history of this issue. So what did we know when?
Yeah, it's like volleyball, Mark. You set it up. Martha and Nick set it up for the spike. So yeah, what you just laid out is actually exactly what was predicted. So this was from an incredible 1971 conference on underground waste management. That's basically injection wells. Here's the book. Earthquakes were predicted, but the second quote is really important. Waste will always and inevitably escape the injection zone and engulf everything in its inexorable migration toward the discharge boundaries of the flow system. So what Ferris is saying is that essentially you cannot think of this as a safe confining zone. It is leaking from the moment you inject it, and it's just a matter of time until it gets to the edge of the system. And that quote goes on to describe the edge of the system being a spring, a water well, a seep in the side of the road, or most prominently, an oil and gas well, right? Because these are conduits, straws that connect the subsurface to the surface. And Ferris also points out that initially, if you have a water well, it may first flow with extra, with water, with additional pressure, right? That's because as the waste is going down, it's pushing whatever fluids may already be occupying this pore space out of the way. And if that's fresh water, which it often is, you might be like, oh, wow, my water well is flowing really well. And then Ferris describes the, quote, sinister laggard. Eventually, the waste cylinder arrives. So both the examples Nick and Martha just laid out exhibit this kind of like, whack-a-mole of the waste popping up. And then this interesting quote also about lawsuits. That's happening now too. And then we can go to the next slide. Nick just walked through this in really the same exact order. So this is from 1987. This is when the government actually looked at these things. It's an incredible lab that was around in the 80s, the EPA working with the Department of Energy, and they're laying out what could happen. And you see exactly what Nick just described. And again, yeah, all the same things that are happening now. And then the next slide has some really interesting quotes from the EPA. So this is, I think, really, really important. In 1970, before we even had the EPA, we had the Commission we had the Federal Water Quality Administration that was folded into the EPA, which came about the next year. Subsurface injection is a technique limited in space and time and to be used with great caution only until better methods of disposal are developed. They were very, very skeptical. Then the next year, EPA Assistant Administrator for Research and Monitoring, so an important official at the EPA, saying deep well injection is a technology of avoiding problems, not solving them in any real sense. We really do not know what happens to the waste down there. We just hope. That's an extraordinary quote. The final one, I think, is the most important because this is a really major aha moment in my own reporting. You have the Clean Air Act, you have the Clean Water Act, you have this period when the country is trying to do better environmentally, and the Clean Water Act was in response to rivers catching fire and sewage and industrial waste going into rivers. That's really bad. We're going to clean up the rivers. And right at that time, injection wells come into use. And it took a while to be led to this quote, but here is EPA saying it in their own words. Little attention was given this technique until the 1960s, when the diminishing capabilities of surface waters to receive effluents without violation of standards made disposal and storage of liquid waste by deep well injection increasingly more attractive. So it's literally shoving it under the carpet. And now, just for fun, we can go to the final slide, which shows the reaction today. And it's really not fun. It's quite unfortunate. But, in the 1970s, in the early 70s, EPA was robust. You had really good research going on. And just the other day, we saw like the kind of end of that arc as the EPA research is literally dismantled. And they're kind of skirting around the issue as if this earlier research and analysis did not exist. And these are different comments I've gotten from my reporting. So yeah, we know, Mark, it's there. And I think once it's there, and as I've learned, communities and people who are really on the front lines of this, they don't forget that. And these facts are still facts, and this information existing is really quite important.
So, as I'm sure that kind of this is the moment where, these impacted, actually, there you are, Nick. Let's talk for a minute, kind of taking these couple pieces together. We talked about orphan wells, we talked about pathways of migration, we talked about, the volumes of the waste. Do you have any examples you can show us of when you ultimately have that moment where it breaks the surface and it becomes a clear and present issue? What does that look like, both for human health, literally, for the environment? What's that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So could we cue up the Tussie video here? So this disgusting video is sort of what this stuff looks like when all these factors that we've talked about combine. So this is an old well. It's in Oklahoma. And it is nearby injected wastewater is gushing to the surface. And for this incident, it was flowing in this place and others nearby for a very long time. Flowed into a nearby creek. And polluted a resident's groundwater. And one of the things I would invite everyone to think about is, you can imagine if this much water is getting through rock and fighting gravity and making its way to the surface, this is a tip of the iceberg situation where, if that much water is reaching the surface for days and weeks on end, you can only imagine how much more is spreading uncontrolled underground. And as Justin pointed out, like, they've known for a long time that the water it is not going to be contained, and it will find the path of least resistance. And you have to imagine that in Oklahoma and Texas and Pennsylvania and Ohio, these places where, we've drilled for oil for a long time, I'll use an image that a source of mine has used repeatedly, like these, especially the rock layers where they're drilling for oil and, often putting some of the wastewater. I mean, they're just Swiss cheese. They're just punctured with so many well bores between orphans and kind of functionally orphan wells that are just sitting there, wells that were plugged a long time ago, often with mud or with not enough cement. There are just a tremendous number of vertical conduits allowing this wastewater to get up from deep below the surface where it's injected to shallow reserves of fresh water, and as you saw in that video, sometimes back up to the surface and into our lives.
So let's shift to the communities who are impacted. What they'll want to know, and what we've got a lot of questions, is kind of the who's responsible, who can I contact, who's in charge here question. So in the modern context, who in government should be in charge of getting a handle on this? And I want to stick with you for a second, Nick, and then go to Justin. So Nick first, from your report in Oklahoma, do you have a sense of why regulators aren't, jumping into action on this? And then Justin, what's the interplay between the state regulator level and the federal regulator level on this topic? Where does jurisdiction stop and start for one versus the other? And, how does that interplay impact how this broader issue is overseen? So Nick, we'll go to you first.
Yeah, in Oklahoma, and I think this applies to a lot of oil states, the state level regulatory agency is, often very underfunded. They're tracking these events. They're, looking into complaints. They're testing groundwater where they can. But they have a backlog of pollution complaints, let alone all of their other tasks to respond to these incidents. Look, tracking the movement of polluted water, wastewater underground is really hard. You often need, I showed you that electromagnetic survey. They've only got one of those machines, or two maybe, but only a handful. And they are playing sort of like whack-a-mole with water starts purging to the surface. You shut down nearby injectors. It keeps flowing. You have to shut down some more. The kind of the actually dramatic moment where the wastewater is spreading underground, we can't see it. So they're often playing catch up to try to figure this out. But then also, in Oklahoma, I can tell you that I have seen internal emails where at the kind of start of when these blowouts were getting really bad, the state was kind of had talked about plans, how they were going to how they were going to address some of this stuff, and through a mix of kind of the task being too big, through some internal pushback, they ended up not fining companies. They wound up, not punishing bad actors. And, some of this does come down to, at times political pressure. I have reported out instances of the industry pushing back on rule changes. The three commissioners for the state level agency in Oklahoma are elected, and are elected with, tremendous amounts, far more than 50% of their campaign donations from the industries they oversee. So, there are kind of practical limitations, and then there are kind of political ones as well, that cause, allow these incidents to continue.
Thanks, and Justin, let's go to you for the kind of federal versus state question.
Yeah, I want to point out how extraordinary it is what Nick and Martha have reported on, because not only are they showing these events happening in real times, right within communities, within homes, in very intimate spaces, but then the reporting shows like the internal back and forth that the agencies are having with themselves, as some people try and move more critically, and people within those same agencies then are telling other people like, no, that's not how we're going to do it. I mean, essentially they're freaking out over how to deal with it. And then you have communities like in Ohio, which are doing what is absolutely, I think, appropriate as you see the problems developing, and looking for some sort of moratorium to say we cannot have injection wells in our community, not because we hate oil and gas, just because we don't want to contaminate our drinking water. We need to preserve that for now and the future. So the interplay has been fascinating. Essentially, I think both sides are watching this, meaning the state and the feds, and then also the industry, and politics have shifted.
Well,
No, it's back. It goes quick. I don't know what's up, but it's all good. So politics have shifted over the past couple of years. So you have essentially the industry would rather have the weaker of the two be regulating injection wells, right? And so early on, again, 1970s, EPA was very strong. States did not want the EPA to control, and so they got what's called primacy. States have control versus the EPA versus the feds. Now the federal agencies have been successfully gutted, and states in some instances have robust controls. And what I get from certain sources is that industry does not like that, and is now maybe looking to the feds and saying, no, maybe that's actually better. So I don't know all these movements because I don't have sourcing that would give me all those details, but there's a push and a pull and a sway, and certainly reporting bringing it to light, and also communities holding it up in front of the regulators is playing a huge role in all of that.
Well, so that's a really great overview of some of the regulatory side. Let's talk about some of the legal side. And I want to go back to Martha for this one. Have any lawsuits been brought to address the damage caused by produced water rising to the surface? What can you tell us about the legal landscape surrounding produced water liability as it currently stands?
Sure. So in Texas, the Railroad Commission has updated its regulations for injection. Not to get into all the details there, but they have acknowledged that injection wells are contributing to these problems at the surface. But we still are seeing ongoing issues. One situation I reported on was actually started back in the 90s when an injection well appears to have failed and caused some groundwater contamination at a ranch where the city of Midland had purchased that land to import groundwater into the city. The problem here was the company did start the cleanup, but then they went bankrupt. So after the bankruptcy, the money they set aside to finish the cleanup eventually ran out, and Midland had to take this on. So that's often an issue in the oil industry. It can be quite volatile. So pinpointing one company to hold responsible isn't always that easy, especially when you have bankruptcy through these booms and busts. And then more recently with landowners who have been affected by leaks and blowouts, they are seeking legal remedy. One recent lawsuit is the first that I'm aware of, where a landowner brought a lawsuit against the injection companies, arguing that their injection wells contributed to underground pressure that caused a blowout on his ranch. The response from the companies, they have denied these claims, and their response is basically, we were following the state rules, we were doing things by the book. So it's this question of, if the regulations have not been adequate, is there a way to hold the companies responsible? And then on the Railroad Commission side, they're dealing with these extremely costly cleanup and plugging operations. Sometimes it costs millions of dollars to clean up one of these blowouts and identify the source. So that's sort of sucking up all of their budget for the year. And there is one instance where this was reported on by the Houston Chronicle. The Railroad Commission is actually seeking to recoup some of those cleanup costs from an injection company. Again, the company is saying, we were following your rules. Why is it on us to pay these cleanup costs? So there's just this tension between, landing on the right regulations to avoid this problem. And in the meantime, landowners and places like Midland being in a bind and not knowing, who to turn to when they have these problems.
Okay, so you all are sufficiently bumming me out. So let's talk about potential solutions to this problem. And Martha, I want to stick with you in Texas for a moment. I'm hearing that we can't inject the wastewater deep and forget about it. We also can't inject it very shallow and forget about it. So what now? Are there alternative options for safely disposing of this waste? What's being proposed and what else have we tried so far? We'll start with you in Texas.
So in Texas, this has been a really hot topic. The regulators, the companies, everyone is pretty much on the same page now that we need something other than injection. The question is, what's that going to be? So Texas is moving forward with a couple options. They have created a permitting program for companies to treat produced water and then discharge that treated water into rivers. So if that sounds concerning, you're not alone. There's a lot of questions about, what specific constituents they're going to have to test for, what limits will they put in place, how is this going to be monitored? And there are some pilot programs going on. This is under the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They have not issued the first big permit for this. There's a few applications to discharge into the Pecos River. So everyone's sort of waiting to see when those permits come out. Another option that there's a permit program for in Texas is to use treated water for irrigation. So I've got some photos here from a lab outside Midland where a company is piloting some of this treatment technology and then using the treated water to irrigate alfalfa, which is that middle photo. So again, a lot of legitimate questions about how clean is clean enough if we're treating this water and using it outside the oil fields. And with any of these, a big question is cost. Injection wells are still by far the cheapest option. And particularly for the Permian, this water is so salty that it has to go through a very intensive desalination process, which is very energy intensive. It's very costly. So the question is whether they can bring down these treatment technologies to a cost that's competitive. There's other ideas like mining lithium and critical minerals out of the water. So there's a lot of different options on the table, each with their own pros and cons. And then, if you look to the other side of the Permian in New Mexico, the regulators have taken a more cautious approach. Up until this point, they have said they're not going to issue permits to use treated produced water outside of the oil fields. There's been a lot of pushback from some NGOs. So, just even between Texas and New Mexico, there's quite a big difference. And that's definitely something I'll be tracking, which of these technologies can really get off the ground.
Great. So I want to move a little quickly to get to some audience Q&A, but so just a lightning round for all three of the panelists on this one. We talked about your perspectives from journalist side, but over the course of your reporting, what responses have you gotten from the industry and from regulators? And kind of those can be actual, just what they've told you, or have any laws, policies, or anything else like that kind of changed in response to your work? So let's go east to west. Maybe Justin, let's kick it to you really quick to chat about responses you've gotten for your work.
I think we have a fun slide to address that. So that's another fun slide. We'll get to that one. The final slide with the security alert. So essentially, yeah, the response is the industry is really upset that people are talking about this. So this security alert was put out by the Ohio Oil and Gas Association, UGA. It wasn't so much in response to me, but the first thing there, a public meeting about class 2 injection wells. This was an amazing meeting, like 350 people attended. It's a testament to local organizing, to local people caring about this issue. I mean, that's like, you know, if you are in music and put on a show and like 10 people show up, it's good. 350 people came, they packed an auditorium in a local college. And that really worried the industry. And then they put out this kind of ridiculous thing. I challenged them to a duel, like Billy the Kid style. I said, let's have a shootout. They haven't taken me up on that. But I think the serious nature is that we are protected as journalists. Yeah, there's pushback, that's expected. Community members who raise alarm have much more pushback. They get really a varying degree of like heckling to outright really intimidation that occurs, and also whistleblowers, you know, workers, people within industry receive a real like extraordinary attack.
Let's go to Oklahoma. Nick, what have you been hearing from regulators, industry there?
Well, I certainly don't have anything that good, but in general from industry, I find it very hard to get them to kind of talk to me on the record and answer my questions directly about injection practices. When it comes to regulators, I get a variety of responses, often along the lines of, saying that they're trying to make companies follow the rules on all that. I will just briefly note that in one of the stories that I've done here, there was a quote that it does seem to have certainly come up a lot since the story ran, which is where a representative of the Oklahoma Corporation Commission said that their approach to regulation was that they lead with a handshake and not a hammer, was the line. And I do think that was in quite, it was a candid summary of how they often treat the industry and pollution in the state of Oklahoma, which is that a pollution event happens. The goal is to get operators back into compliance, but there's less of an emphasis on punishing habitual bad actors, kind of disincentivizing future bad behavior by punishment, fines, taking companies to court, that sort of thing.
And we'll close the lightning round with Martha. What are you hearing in Texas?
In Texas, the regulators are trying to walk this tightrope between addressing these very urgent problems that they're seeing with blowouts, but not tightening the regulations too much that would constrain oil production. This has all been playing out in the Permian Basin, which is the most productive oil basin in the continent. And, especially now with the war in Iran, the U.S. is really counting on the Permian to be its oil powerhouse for the decades to come. And the Railroad Commission, is very hesitant to kind of put any blanket restrictions on injection. So they've been sort of turning the dials here and there to figure out how to stop some of these worst impacts. But without going so far as to limit the oil and gas production, and meanwhile just putting this emphasis on finding alternatives to injection and kind of trying to get those permitting programs up and running as soon as they can.
Okay. Well, let's shift to some questions from the audience. We've built today's Q&A around many thoughtful questions submitted in advance through the event registration form, so thank you for everyone who did that. We may not be able to get to new questions live today, but we'll keep an eye on everything that you're putting in the Q&A portion here, and especially as we explore topics for our future coverage. Before we start with our first question, I'd like to share a link to our event survey on the screen. Filling it out helps inform the content of ProPublica's future events. So, Justin, I want to start with you one more time here. We've talked about a lot of pieces of this. What we haven't talked about is labor and people who are doing some of the work around this physical substance. We received a question about worker health, especially in Ohio and Pennsylvania, where you've done a lot of work. This viewer asked, quote, if the public or workers believe there are high radiation exposures from radium and oil and gas waste, has OSHA ever been asked to review any oil and gas operation? Quote, has Department of Transport ever been asked to inspect hazmat compliance in Pennsylvania and Ohio? So I'll ask you, what dangers does produced waste pose to workers, and who's working on that question?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the waste itself has these really complicated constituents. They're especially concerning for workers when they're concentrated. So if you have a truck carrying produced water, there may well be a little skein of material sludge that eventually accumulates on the bottom of that truck or on the bottom of a tank. So even more so than the driver, and it could be the same person, the individual who goes in and cleans out that tank, whether it's the produced water tank at the wellhead or the truck, or the treatment plant where there's a big impoundment or something that accumulates a sludge, that's potentially a really significant exposure. PPE is often quite minimal, and just really terrible stories that I've unearthed in my reporting of the type of people who are made to do that job. Oil and gas waste enjoys a stunning exemption. It's called the Benson and Bell Amendment exemption. So it literally can be as radioactive as the core of a nuclear power plant, and it will still be defined as non-hazardous. That's exceptional. That also means the worker is thinking that they're dealing with non-hazardous material, is being paid in that way, is being dressed in that way. There is, I think I put a link recently, there is fascinating movement on that. There is now a union between some workers, specifically truck drivers and environmental groups, and Earth Justice just came out with a big announcement about that project. So I feel like that sort of thing is really frightening to the industry, where you have a union of labor and environmental groups. When the workers find out, they're typically really, really concerned, although sometimes they still need that sort of jobs. And I want to answer the OSHA part of the question. OSHA is just, in some aspects of the oil field, they're sort of there, but in many aspects, they're just completely absent. And this is one of those aspects. Their responses on this issue have been really strange and utterly negligent. And they often only take things seriously when a worker brings the concern. And that creates a really difficult situation because a worker faces risks. So it's been really hard to engage OSHA, at least at the federal level, on this issue, but they certainly need to be there.
I want to go back to Nick for the Orphan well expertise. We had a question come in, quote, what would an ideal full life cycle accountability from drilling to final well closure look like for oil and gas companies? So Nick, you speak to that, and I'll add, how would this help mitigate the produced water crisis if we address the orphan well crisis?
Yeah, I mean, that's a complicated question. I think by some measures, there are nearly 90% of wells, unplugged oil and gas wells in this country right now are either inactive or produce very little oil and gas. So we have a tremendous number of orphan wells already. We have a tremendous number that were drilled and we don't know are there. And we have a lot more coming. And I can't overstate, especially in these old oil states, that they're just finding them all the time. The director of the Oklahoma Corporation Commission's oil division has said things like, we go out to plug one orphan and we come back with 4 more to add to the list. And so what do you do to prevent more of these orphans? The kind of classic mechanism that basically every oil state uses is financial assurance, requires the industry to set aside funds, typically in the form of bonds, to ensure that that the money to plug and clean up these wells is set aside, even if the company goes bankrupt. And So, it's a kind of classic carrot and stick system. You want the reward to be high enough to incentivize plugging. And this is something that Mark and I have worked together on extensively, is that there are, that the amount of money set aside to clean up our the wells that are sitting out there right now is just a fraction of the overall cleanup cost. Now, it would probably be unrealistic to say that every well should have, the exact full cost of its cleanup set aside. That's just probably not going to happen in a lot of oil states, although that would solve the problem. You would have cleanup insured. But, we've talked to some oil states that have kind of good bonding programs, and they say, maybe we want around 10% of, our total plugging liability set aside. And, the story that Mark and I did for ProPublica, I think we found that nationally there is less than 2% set aside of the full cost of plugging set aside in bonds. And the way this relates to the injection problem is, I talked about this before, is that every unplugged well combined with injected wastewater is a potential conduit for that wastewater to get up into drinking water and to blast out to the surface. So the more properly plugged wells we have, and the better financial mechanisms to ensure that those wells are plugged, we are reducing the number of avenues for that waste to spread.
Thanks, Nick. And so looking through the questions that are coming in now and that came in earlier, I see a lot of engaged folks who are looking for kind of news they can use. So I'm going to talk about the questions we've gotten about data availability. If people want to learn more, and we've talked high levels, if they want to localize it maybe to wherever they are and act on that, where can they look? One person asked, quote, do you know of a national map indicating where oil drilling / fracking is taking place, or it's taken place in the past 25 years? Another person asked, quote, is there an inventory of plumes by location and severity? So I'll open up for the panel, what data do and don't exist? And kind of at a second level, why perhaps does some of the data maybe exist or not exist?
I can jump in with a few resources. It depends a lot state to state. So I'm in Texas. The Railroad Commission does have a lot of resources online. They have a very comprehensive GIS map on their website if you want to nerd out and look at where all the injection wells are and where the plugged wells are. But it gets a little tricky when you try and look nationwide. The U.S. Geological Survey put out a lot of good resources on orphan wells that include information across the states. And then there's some organizations like Frac Tracker that does a lot of mapping on this issue. Specifically for produced water, there are some requirements for companies to report the produced water and also chemicals that they're using. A lot of that information is available on the Frac Focus website. But yeah, I'll toss it over to Nick or Justin to add anything else.
Yeah, I mean, like Justin said, the fact that the EPA has turned over regulation of injection to the states means that we have a really piecemeal system. And so there isn't really a comprehensive version of this. And so, Oklahoma, where I cover it, is, it also has a GIS map of, every well in the state. And if you can, figure that out, you can identify some of this stuff. But in Oklahoma, for instance, there's no comprehensive database of polluted aquifers, for instance, or much information on, kind of if to find where pollution has occurred. I will just also flag that if you are, if you're on a public, municipal water supply, public water supply, there are these things called EPA consumer confidence reports that are regular testing of public water supplies, and they do include, the testing isn't great, it's too irregular, but it will tell you what is in your drinking water.
And Nick, let's stay with you for just one more question here. Another thing that I'm going to kind of paraphrase, since it seems like we have a number of listeners who may be on groundwater or may have their own well and are concerned about that. So any suggestion for indicators they should be looking for in private wells, for private well owners who may suspect that their well has, their well water has come into contact with some of this contamination?
Yeah, it's really hard, right? The makeup of this stuff varies from place to place, but kind of the classic indicator is high salt levels. But usually you need other things because groundwater can be naturally briny. So there's a kind of list of normal heavy metals. Barium, bromide, strontium are very common. Very commonly occur in produced water. There are also tests that show kind of like gasoline range, contaminants that can show benzene and kind of other instances of petroleum. But I'm not a chemist, and if I missed anything, I'd love for Justin and Martha to.
I would just add that for people on private well water, it's really important, if possible, to get some baseline water quality testing, because the challenge is once you detect something, it's very hard to pinpoint what the source is. So if you have, oil drilling expanding in your area, try and get that baseline data of your water quality before. I realize that's not always possible because, lots of these places, there's been decades of industrial activity, but, having that data showing before the potential contamination helps a lot.
So, Justin, I want to give you perhaps the last word. We've also received a number of questions on, on different areas, different levels of jurisdiction. Obviously, this kind of can get very complicated as you go underground, above ground, move laterally, what have you. So, in these questions about regulating and otherwise dealing with this issue, how it works in one part of the country versus another. I mean, you've crisscrossed the nation in your work on this issue. So, can you talk about how this problem and its potential solutions, do or do not vary across the U.S. And in particular, does any state law, deal with this, or how much does it differ, really, state by state?
Yeah, I think law forms around ideas that we know, and as we try and define, right, and we are still wrapping our minds around this, and thus law and liability is being defined in this moment, and it does vary state to state. Like an interesting law that came up, or was legislation that was passed and eventually stricken in North Dakota. The state tried to essentially take the pore space and give it to industry. This is a really interesting idea. If you do believe that it's fine to inject this stuff down there, who do you have to pay? Should you pay someone? I mean, that is a common good of Earth. And people are, if you do think it's a container, like filling that container, and there's not necessarily money being paid to some place, there's no value assigned. So that's a really interesting idea. Like, what is the value of this? But I think what I also have learned, to go to the second part of your question, people, communities, as they learn about this issue, they're very upset. So maybe we can quickly show the slide, even though it's a strong one to show at the end. But treatment is a major problem. I mean, the industry has walked themselves into a corner by not really paying close attention to how to deal with this wastewater. It's the loophole nature of the regulations that have enabled them, in my opinion, to be lazy. And so in the Marcellus, where I've spent a lot of my time reporting in the Northeast, we've had some really stunning problems. And that's because there are heavy metals, there's radioactive heavy metals. If you're treating, you are inherently trying to remove the bad stuff, which means you're concentrating it. And so we've literally ended up with radioactive Superfund sites that high school kids have partied at. This actually happened. So my call to Texas and New Mexico and anyone reporting on it is just, okay, fine, you're going to clean it. What are you going to do with the material you pull out of it? And not just the lithium, what everyone's excited about, but some of the more dangerous, heavy, and radioactive metals. And I have not seen the industry solve that problem yet. And in a sense, it's part of the larger problem of they're still trying to figure out the waste problem. It's just something they're trying to solve in real time. And yet with fracking, we now have more and more and more. They're just completely overwhelmed with wastewater.
All right, well, thank you for that overview of where we're at. So that is all the time we have for today. I'm beyond grateful to Nick, Martha, and Justin, both for joining us today, as well as for their work investigating the failures that have created the oil and gas wastewater crisis we're now facing. I saw a ton of fascinating, very helpful, very thoughtful, nuanced questions and discussion coming in the chat that we simply just didn't have the time to get to. So if any of today's attendees have information, documents, things like that, that you want to share about the oil industry's produced water crisis or anything our panelists mentioned, we do want to hear from you. You can click on the link on screen to contact us securely and submit a tip. We host these virtual conversations every month. If you haven't yet, please sign up for our events newsletter so you don't miss out on any of these. We'll share the link to that newsletter in the follow-up email, along with the list of relevant resources. From all of us, ProPublica and our partner publications, thank you for joining us. Have a great evening. Keep reading the news. We'll see you next time.